So our next presenters are Len Tooley and Cameron Schwartz. Len Tooley brings over 15 years of experience in community-based sexual health work, research, and advocacy to his role as CBRC's Research and Evaluation Manager in Vancouver. Prior to this role, Len managed numerous regional and national gay, bi, queer, men's research initiatives and knowledge translation projects. He has also provided HIV testing and sexual health counseling in Toronto's bathhouses for 10 years. Len strives to integrate basic science and academic rigor with emancipatory and community-driven action. Len's work will focus on using research-based evidence to optimize advanced programs to maximize their relevance and impact. And Cameron is a second-year Master of Public Health student at the Simon Fraser University. He has a background in harm reduction programming and substance use services. Cameron has been involved with CBRC since this spring as a practicum student and an investigators program participant. So please welcome Len and Cameron.
Hello. Hello.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Peter. So might as well just jump right in. In 2014, I was at an international conference and doing a presentation, like a pretty large presentation with a huge number of people there, and like had a relatively mortifying experience. Like I just could not stick to the clock. And as I was looking at the lights on the clock, they weren't somehow appearing to me. And it was sort of like I was wondering if I was just like super nervous or what it was. But over the next few days, I realized that like something actually was happening. Like my eyes were not working as well. Like I wasn't able to see the things in the center of my vision. And so that led to like months of investigations with like sort of ever increasingly specialized specialists in Toronto, retinal specialists. And they they're like injecting vegetable dye into me so that they can take special scans of my eyes and stuff. And so I have all these really interesting pictures of my like eyes, which is a thing. But basically what they could tell me was that my retina was degenerating, but they didn't know why. And it was both of them, and so the like prognosis was that I was probably going to lose my vision, but like we don't know. Like we don't know when, we don't know what this is. So that was a worrying experience. So maybe like 6 months, say, after this whole sort of debacle began, I was working at my job at Katie and reading, looking just through. There was a listserv, like an email listserv called the rectal rectal microbicides listserv, which I don't know if it's still around. I've signed up to it, but it's like one of the best sources of information and like sort of thought, I think. So I highly recommend it. Anyway, there was a posting on an article about poppers, and one of the things that I like hate to love to do is like read articles about poppers that are like often I find fear-mongering and not really reflective of how I don't feel that poppers are so dangerous. So I'm reading through and I'm getting like pretty excited about it, like, and I'm really starting to rip into everything that I can, just because I like find that fun sometimes. And I come up to this paragraph and it mentions what was it called? So I'm gonna just tell you. It mentions this paper that was done that showed in this group of HIV positive men who were habitual poppers users that they had some degradation of their retina. And I see these scans, and they're the exact same scans that I had been shown by my specialist. So I put the two and two together and realized that like somehow poppers was like leading to me losing my vision. So it was a really interesting moment to be working in gay men's health and then sort of discover an issue about yourself. So that sort of like got me really more and more interested in poppers and their effect on people's bodies and my body. Fast forward to a few months ago, Cameron approached CBRC about doing a practicum at the organization, and was really interested in looking into poppers, and so that led to a summer practicum on poppers and the poppers ban, and I'm going to pass it over to Cameron.
Right. Yeah, so the scope of the project that Len and I were working on this summer was basically as comprehensive as we could do of a literature review on the academic work that's been done on poppers over 13 weeks. So we're going to touch on a lot of that today, but not quite all of it. So yeah, if you have any other questions about things that aren't mentioned in the presentation, please ask. But just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about what poppers are, what they do in the body, but also why they're important to gay culture specifically, so what place they've had in the history of gay men in Canada and the current culture around them. Yeah, we're also going to talk about some common assumptions or misconceptions around what poppers do in the body. And then we're going to kind of switch gears and talk more about the ban. So what happened, one thing that led to this project is actually a change in government policy about 5 years ago. So we'll delve into what happened and the impact that it's actually had on gay men in Canada. So what are poppers? Poppers are referred to by some governments as a drug, and I say some because they don't actually cross the blood-brain barrier, and so depending on the definition you use, they are a drug or not a drug. But they actually refer to a family of chemicals. So you can see a bunch of different poppers bottles on the right there. And since the ban is actually, there's not one chemical that defines poppers. They refer to any chemical in the family of alkyl nitrites. So they're inhaled. What they do is they actually relax your smooth muscle in your body, and they are a vasodilator. And this is one of the reasons why they're popular among gay men, and they have been historically as well. That relaxation of smooth muscle actually facilitates anal sex, so it actually makes it a lot easier to bottom. And I think it's also important to mention now that for a long time, since the 70s, they've been sold off-label in sex shops. And since that policy change, which again we'll get into later in the presentation, they actually have been banned for all sale in Canada.
Yeah, so just like from another like perspective or some other things that are like good to know about poppers. First of all, I don't think any of those are actually really genuine ones, and I find it fascinating and hilarious that they seem never fake because the real labels don't look like that. Secondly, so like I realize that not everyone maybe has done poppers before, and it's not quite clear like what inhalation is. So to give people a sense of like how poppers are used, this is not poppers, but if you were to use poppers, you put them like right up to your nose and you go like that would be a very small amount of poppers. But if you do this, you're just like smelling the like room odorizer, which is one thing that they're sold as, or leather cleaner. But you can also go use your lips as well, and that's a little bit safer in terms of getting poppers burn, which is when you spill some on your nose and have a red ring around your nose because of poppers. Sorry, everybody, for telling your secrets. So that's a little bit more about poppers.
Yeah. And yeah, so we're talking about the context. Yeah, just showing some ads from the 80s, for example. Like these have been really integrated into gay culture for a long time. A lot of media sources, portray poppers as this new like drug craze that's taking over, and that's just not the case. They've been around for a very long time. It's another example of Rush Man, personal favorite.
Cleaning up with poppers.
And this is a more contemporary example. This is a new type of porn, this new category of porn that's these poppers training videos that's emerging. So they still are relevant. People still are using poppers, and they're still being integrated into new forms of cultural media.
Yeah, so these videos are like, in case you haven't heard of them, I just found out about them recently, like myself, through a senior staff person at CBRC, actually. No, I'm kidding, they're not actually staff, they're not staff. Or maybe they are, we'll never know. So like these videos, but basically what they do is they have like clips of different like porns of like different types of scenes, and then they have like sort of music to go with it, and then instructions. It'll be like, all right, like take a huff for 15 seconds, and you're supposed to for 15 seconds go. And then they say, hold it. And then there's like a countdown, and like it's like they're like these 20-minute affairs. like, and there's sort of like challenges. Like some of them are like, see if you can get through 20 minutes of this. And so these are like really a new thing that I just learned about within the past few months. But I think to me, they really show that like poppers are still very culturally relevant to queer guys. I mean, and other people, but definitely to queer and gay sex culture.
Yeah, so just a bit more about why this is relevant. So it's not only cultural. This is a number from the past iteration of the CBRC Sex Now survey. So roughly 30% of gay men and other men who have sex with men in Canada have used poppers in the last 12 months. So that's not a small number of people, 30% of GBMSM in Canada. It's also relevant because of the recent policy change. So in 2013, Health Canada decided to crack down on poppers. Like I said, they were previously available in sex stores, bathhouses, those kinds of environments, and Health Canada has cracked down on them, and so they are no longer legal to be sold. And it's also relevant because there's a lot of misinformation around the health effects of poppers and what they actually do, and a lot of this is coming up fairly recently as well. This is just an example of some of the headlines that are going around. Yeah, so we're going to explore how legitimate is this? Are poppers really cooking your brain? We'll find out.
And just to comment, like these are the kinds of articles that I like to pull out and like really sort of read through and think about, because like they're pretty like it feels like there's a little bit of a moral panic going on. Like these are not, to me, like progressive positions to have on any substance, really, like necessarily, unless the substance actually cooks your brain, which would be like a marvel of technology.
Yeah. As you can probably tell at this point, we are taking a harm reduction informed lens for this presentation, as well as a sex positive lens. And so I want to ground the discussion around health effects with this quote from the 80s. So this is from Thomas Lowry, who was a researcher at that time. And he said that the inhalable nitrites, or poppers, they might be the nearest thing that exists to a true aphrodisiac. So like I said before, they actually have really like pragmatic reasons that people might use poppers for facilitating anal sex, but there also are other valid reasons that people use them, and some people do refer to them as an aphrodisiac as well.
And just to point out, that was 1982, right? So just like what a moment to write that. But it sounds like a beautiful vision, I think, and it's relevant. It's relevant to note, because later on, I think we'll get to that point. So.
Yeah. And so, yeah, this brings us to how real are the negative health effects. How legitimately concerned do people actually have to be if they're using poppers? And so, the majority of health concerns that people are actually going to face are going to be headaches and skin irritation. So, like Len was talking about, poppers, burns. However, there are other areas of developing research. One of them is immunosuppression, for example. So some studies have shown decreases in CD3 plus T cells and natural killer cells. So these are just certain cells in your bloodstream and in your immune system that fight against pathogens. But yeah, these studies are fairly preliminary, and they've been showing effects for people who have used poppers every day for a long time. There's also been a lot of work done around viral transmission rates and poppers use. However, this research is fairly conflicting in the literature. Some people say different things, and so we aren't going to get too bogged down with that today.
Can I make a note on that?
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that I think that is good that this sort of points out to, or a history of poppers, is that in the early years of AIDS, people were doing research into whether poppers was one of the causes of, I don't know if they were looking into it when it was still called GRID, but it was like a very early on question that was asked. And I think a theme that I would say you might see through the literature around that does exist on poppers that it still focuses a lot on how poppers relate to sexually transmitted infections and HIV transmission. So that research is ongoing, and they're really trying hard to figure out if poppers can do something to STI transmission rates. But generally, it's you might get a headache or a little burn on your nose. That's almost as bad as they get. These other questions, they really are doing a lot of research because they're having. I would say that it hasn't really shown to be too dramatic of an impact on sexually transmitted infections necessarily.
So that leads us into the ban, talking about the health effects. So why would Health Canada decide all of a sudden, after poppers had been used in such prevalence for so long, to crack down on them? So yeah, we've been over a bit of the context around the ban, but just a bit more detail. So they did have the RCMP pull poppers from storefronts. They also threatened fines and criminal charges for people who might be selling poppers. What they did is they actually didn't write any new legislature, so they just filed poppers under the Food and Drugs Act, which has existed since 1985. And so they essentially made poppers illegal to sell, but this meant, because they weren't under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, that they were not legal, or not illegal, I should say, to possess or to buy. And so this is a screenshot from Health Canada's current website on poppers. So again, one of the headlines from before. Two things that they were mentioning for, I guess, legitimate reasons to be concerned about poppers are the relationship to poppers overdose, as well as, which we'll get into in a second, as well as contraindications with other drugs, so drug interactions.
Can we make it just a note quickly? I think, just to go back to that last slide, one thing to point out, this is around, I think, when the crackdown started happening. And at the time, I think it's worth pointing out that it was like the Conservatives were in power, and at the time they had like an anti-drug strategy that they were developing. So there are some broader context there around what may have led to like the motivation behind the crackdown.
Yeah, so it's part of their national anti-drug strategy, which they enacted over 5 years. So just addressing poppers overdose, because it's something that Health Canada brings up. So it is technically possible to overdose from poppers, but in reality it's extremely rare. So this is a quote from the same researcher as before, saying that approximately, this is in the 80s, 250 million recreational doses of poppers were being consumed every year in the States. Like 250 million doses, and not a single death had been reported from inhalation at that point. But it is possible. So you see on the right, there's a diagram of hemoglobin and methemoglobin. So methemoglobin is naturally present in your bloodstream, and it is a converted form of hemoglobin that is unable to carry oxygen. And what happens in poppers overdose is if someone, for example, drinks a bottle of poppers, they get so much, the poppers interact in their bloodstream with the regular hemoglobin, and this buildup of methemoglobin allows, or it does not allow the blood to like properly circulate oxygen. And so you could essentially result in a lack of oxygen to the brain. But yeah, it's extremely rare, and treatment does actually exist for it.
Yeah, and you also have to drink the poppers in order for this to happen, which like you can't really drink, but you just, it's not, I don't know, it would be like drinking gasoline, like you know sort of that this is not how to do it. So harm reduction message number one, don't drink your poppers, which some people might not know it, but don't. But you know, like what, like, you know, Cameron's research told me a little bit about like the ban was that like, if this is like the worst that it can get, like it's really not that much of a problem. Like probably the most you would, like from, you know, what people have told me about poppers use, is that like the most that you would see this playing out is like having really blue lips. So sometimes if someone does a lot of poppers one night, their lips will be blue. They probably weren't out in the cold, but maybe.
So then just building into the other main point that Health Canada brought up on their website is the potential interaction between poppers and another drug. Specifically, Viagra is the main one that keeps popping up in the literature. And this can all be traced back to one statement that was issued by Pfizer in relation to Viagra and poppers in '98. And so Pfizer said that because both of them are vasodilators, both of them result in decreased blood pressure, and using them at the same time could potentially result in heart problems. So this is definitely, you know, it seems biologically plausible. They weren't totally off the wall saying that. However, we reviewed hundreds of papers about poppers this summer, and not a single one mentioned any like legitimate real-life case of this happening. So yeah, not to say, you know, I'm not encouraging everyone to push their boundaries when it comes to mixing drugs together. However, this evidence doesn't actually seem to be reported in any cases.
Yeah, and on a similar note, Cameron, one of the things Cameron did was call the National Poison Control Center.
Provincial, yeah.
Yeah, the provincial one. Okay, and that's like the service that that is the last, like the place that you call when there's like a problem with a chemical, right? Like you've been exposed to a chemical. Because we were sort of curious to know, like, you know, if someone goes to the emergency room with some kind of poppers related crisis, like what would that look like? And they might get that call. And I guess like from what I understand, like what they said is that really mostly what they're getting calls about has to do with like the burns, like if they're spilled when they're being done, like, and not so much about like, they didn't really talk about, I don't think, methemoglobia as like a huge concern, but it's, you know, it is, I think it has happened.
Yeah, there are case reports of the previous condition happening, poppers overdose, but yeah, oftentimes it's from drinking poppers, and the few cases that do exist from inhalation are very rare. Yeah, so just talking about the research in context, we've already kind of gotten this point across, I think, but poppers have been used for a really long time without a lot of negative health effects being reported by the individual who uses them. David Nutt, who's like a famous drug policy analyst in the UK, cited poppers as being, you know, one of the safest recreational drugs that actually exists on the world. So like many drugs, there's still a lot to learn. I think there's a lot that we can learn about population attributable risk, for example, when it comes to poppers use, but right now we can't say a lot about, you know, supporting those headlines that we saw earlier.
Interestingly, I've also heard it argued that Viagra is another one of the very safe recreational drugs that is pretty widely used as well. Just a note.
But one thing
that wasn't political. It didn't intend to be.
But yeah, getting back to what Len brought up in the beginning of the talk is poppers maculopathy. So this is a health concern that's novel and that does appear to be causing problems for people. So it's particularly associated with one kind of poppers. I said in the beginning that poppers are a family of chemicals. Poppers maculopathy has been disproportionately associated with isopropyl nitrate, which is a chemical that has emerged after the ban. So oftentimes this is reported in the literature where people describe changing poppers brands, or they'll have used poppers for a decade and then all of a sudden they change brands, supposedly to use something that contains isopropyl nitrate, and all of a sudden this condition occurs.
Ta-da! So this must have been what happened to me, right? Going back to the piece around my vision loss. So that's worth noting, right? I mean, another thing that is worth noting is that the diversification in chemicals that were called poppers happened around when there was more global crackdown around poppers, like generally. And so it seems as though, I mean, this is not a new story in like around substances, I don't think, but like, you know, okay, well, if we can sell amyl nitrate, maybe we can sell butyl nitrate, and there are different kinds, and isopropyl nitrate. And so the ban, like one of the functions of bans generally has been to diversify the chemicals, some of which are less safe than others. And yeah, please continue.
Yeah, and so now poppers today, people are still using them in fairly high prevalence, but there are new chemicals on the market, like Len was just saying, and there's actually no regulation at all now. Even before, you could have a brand that you could know to be somewhat trustworthy, but you can see on the right, there's actually like just blatantly fake branding that's emerging. So there's really, as a consumer, there's no way to know what you're buying anymore.
Those are not real jungle juice poppers. So that image is, yeah, they have usually the label for real jungle juice poppers is printed onto the, like is stuck onto the glass directly. It's not vacuum packed. I know this because we have a poppers factory locally in Delta, or it's not in, is it in Delta?
On Annacis Island, yeah.
Annacis Island, that makes and sells one of the most popular poppers brands in the world, and exports them globally, but we can't buy them here. It's sort of like asbestos, I think, but much better than asbestos. It's like the opposite of asbestos, though, similar, yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, generally outcomes from the ban. So people aren't reducing their poppers use generally. So instead, they're buying poppers from dealers, for example. They're bringing them over the border, or they're buying them online. So the prohibitory ban that Health Canada issued is actually not prohibiting people from buying poppers at all.
Yeah. So can I make a couple notes on that? So yeah, gay men are still doing poppers. Surprise, 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 if anyone didn't know. And the stat that Cameron mentioned earlier, the 30%, that was from Sex Now data that was produced after the ban came into place. And it was relatively similar to the previous survey in terms of levels of popper use. So the ban didn't seem to stop gay men from doing what they want, which is a nice demonstration of resilience. But it did mean that gay men just buy their poppers from drug dealers mostly, or go across the border to the States, or try to have them shipped in. But it basically prevented anyone from being able to really know what kind of poppers they were getting. Before, there were sort of reputable businesses that would work with other reputable businesses, and they would have chains of distribution. And those systems were disassembled. And so, as the previous slide mentioned, people are making them at home. I think that Vancouverites were particularly innovative. That just after the ban, I came to Vancouver for a summit, and while I was here, met someone who had started a poppers business with his friend, and his friend made the poppers, and he bottled the poppers. This is pretty forward-thinking activity, I think. But there are recipes on the internet, and it's not that hard to make them. It's feasible, and they'll even tell you oh, and do this to get this kind of nitrate or this kind of. So it's a pretty sort of interesting situation in terms of not being able to have a sense of what. Thank you. What does green mean? 5 minutes? Perfect. Thank you.
Right, so just kind of to conclude what we've been talking about, a lot of these themes. So there's a lot of parallels in drug policy. So you can think of a lot of examples, alcohol, cannabis being the most common. But prohibition has not led to abstinence, as we were just talking about. Instead, it's created this unregulated drug market, which clearly has negative health effects, including potential vision loss for people who use poppers.
Which, by the way, can repair itself. So yeah, I guess to end that piece, my vision did get better, and I do still use poppers, and it hasn't got bad. So I think that there is a lesson there around being aware of levels of use, but it's not the damage that has been noted generally isn't permanent damage. Yeah.
Yeah, so just kind of to wrap it all up, so this is an example of a paternalistic approach to drug policy. It's a totemic response to drug policy. And so Health Canada under the Harper government did not issue any public health messaging around poppers. They essentially just banned them. They sent the RCMP to take them off the storefronts. But no response was actually from Health Canada in terms of messaging. And so there's also a lack of research. This wasn't accompanied by any new research funding at all, as well as there just wasn't any evaluation. So yeah, the numbers Len was saying that we took from before and after the ban of poppers prevalence was from our data, from CBRC, not from Health Canada. So there was really no effort on their part, it seems like, to actually evaluate their policy. And yeah, just as a last little plug, I guess the Director of Health Policy now at Health Canada, or Drug Policy from Health Canada, is taking open consultations around drug policy. So if you have an opinion to share about drug policy, or if you'd like to see something like this change, there's an open invite to share those opinions now. So if you want a link to that, I'm happy to provide it.
Yeah, and as you might have noticed, I'm not the biggest fan of the poppers ban for reasons about that come from personal experience. But what was I going to say about it again? So yeah, I just wanted to make a note about what are you doing about it, Len? It's that's what I ask myself a little bit. This has been a really awesome collaboration for me, and so thank you, Cameron, for doing excellent work. Cameron is really very works really hard and is really dedicated and has a really I think open mind and good approach to things. I know that Cameron's going to be doing some more work through his master's on poppers and sort of I think pulling the literature together. We're sort of like playing with the idea of us doing some kind of freedom of information request to like I'm just curious to know like how did that work out for the government? Like who sat down and spent a couple days like writing up policy about poppers? Like that person would be interesting to talk to, because they must have been curious about like what poppers were. Like I can't imagine that process. I know someone in Ottawa who's responsible for like writing to people who had tried to buy them online. And so like because this happened, I tried to buy them online and instead of receiving it was such a downer. Instead of receiving the poppers, I received like a 6-page letter from Health Canada about how poppers were not allowed, you couldn't buy poppers. Like, so, but like someone spends some serious time like mailing people information about the poppers ban. That's just an interesting reflection.
That being said, yeah, so here are the references are actually from the slides. If you'd like to know any more of the sources that were used for the whole project, feel free to follow up. Do we have time for questions? Or?
I'm going to keep it to 5 minutes, and then I'm going to open up discussion to the rest of the panel, okay?
Great.
Yeah, if anyone has questions now.
Oh, here they come.
So the first question I had actually was about Len's eyes. So I'm glad glad you answered it before I could ask. I'm glad that they're doing good. I know you guys are not here as as eye specialists, but it did concern me because of course as soon as you started talking about the retinal damage, of course, then I started to look it up. And then it is, they can't predict when it's happening or not happening, at least according to the minimal literature I was able to do on Dr. Google, Google Scholar. But I'm just curious, if it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, how come it damages part of your brain, which is your retina?
So there's one proposed pathway that's around nitric oxide. So it's the endogenous way that poppers actually act in your body. So nitric oxide is naturally present, but there is some association with the increase that some people think is causing retinal damage. But it's a proposed theoretical pathway. They don't actually know. And so that's actually not linked to isopropyl nitrate like we were talking about. However, this is like frequently coming up in the case reports as that one chemical. So there's definitely some uncertainty there as to what's actually happening.
So it's like a byproduct of the poppers, but not the poppers itself?
Yeah, essentially.
Thanks, guys. I know you've been working on this for a while. Great job. One of the benefits of having government participation, both from the bureaucracy and from the elected side, is we can ask some questions about these things. So I was wondering, you mentioned that the director is doing an open consultation right now, but were you able to, and you also talked about a Freedom of Information Act, were you able to get any other answers about sort of the behemoth that is Health Canada and where we can find more answers? And if not, I'm wondering if maybe Dana can give us some insight as to where we should be writing or calling, or perhaps our Member of Parliament that's in the audience, Rob Oliphant, may have some ideas as well.
So I can just describe what we've done maybe and then open up the floor. So we've definitely contacted Health Canada and gotten a response. That was from the director as well on drug policy, but they essentially asked around and they knew no one who was able to help us with that information, so they actually couldn't find anyone. I don't know how hard they looked, but they didn't find anyone who could talk to us about the policy itself.
Dana, any insight for us?
Although we're a public health agency as part of the health portfolio, we're separate from Health Canada, and I don't actually know how Health Canada is organized or how that works. But I can absolutely go back and find out and get in touch with you with the right person. But it sounds like you've already reached out and wasn't able to get the answer that you need.
Yeah,
which I'm surprised by.
I think part of the problem is the turnover in staff between the different federal governments as well. But yeah, I'm fairly in the dark on it as well.
I'll go back and get you some names for sure.
Cool, that would be great. Thank you.
Go ahead. Maybe I will respond without much information. Rob Oliphant, Member of Parliament for Don Valley West. I actually received a letter about poppers about a year ago. And it was quite an eloquent, lengthy letter linking essentially unsafe sex practices and poppers, in that the advocate in the letter was saying that without poppers, people are less likely to use condoms because there's more friction and there's less relaxation. And it was quite a long, I'm not sure anatomically correct or not, letter. It still caused my staff to be quite interested and ask me a number of personal questions. What I did with that letter is I did send it to Health Canada, and I have yet to receive a response. What we do as MPs, when we get a letter from a constituent, we send it off to the bureaucracy when you're on the government side and ask them to give us a response that we can turn into a response. So I am still waiting for that. In the government's defense, I would suspect that legalization of cannabis has taken precedence in terms of activity on these files. But I think that it raises or begs a question that actually would draw the chemsec side and the popper side together, which I have myself, and that is research into the effect of criminalization or lack of legalization of any drugs. I am on the record of being absolutely in favor of decriminalization of all drugs. I am working on that slowly, following essentially a Portugal model. I don't see our government moving on it in this mandate. After cannabis, I think you push the needle just a little bit. But I'm wondering about research. What we're hearing is, and it's not criminalization with respect to poppers, it's under the Food and Drug Administration, taking them off and making them inaccessibility has had no effect. Prohibition doesn't work. And we get that on poppers. When it comes to chemsex and that other list of drugs, I'm wondering whether or not there's any part of your research that is related to stigma, criminalization, fear of criminalization, fear of prosecution, relationship to the criminal justice system, and how that probably is a negative, this is only intuitive, a negative factor in terms of good health outcomes. But it's just a suggestion. I don't know whether there's research. It kind of brings the three panels together. You want to respond?
Great, yeah, thank you.
So if you guys would like to respond to that question, and then we still have one more audience member who has a question.
I'll just respond quickly, yeah. Yeah, so Cameron just explained to me recently that really right now it's a matter of enforcement. So the policy, you could argue that it's a policy, but it's not that the law changed or that any specific rules changed. It's just that they started cracking down on it. And because I was sort of wondering at one point during this, what do we actually want to ask for? What do I want to ask for? Do I want poppers to become like a legalized drug, like marijuana is legalized? Probably not, maybe, but really all that it requires is to get Health Canada to stop enforcing, to go back to the olden days. We don't need to necessarily create this whole new framework. They just have to stop doing it, and so that people can clean their boots, their video heads, odorize their rooms, which are all the things that poppers were sold for and have been sold for. They're not sold to use as to huff, but that's what they were. Yeah, what the uses were. I tried cleaning my boots with them once. It wasn't particularly good.
Can I ask, are they still enforcing the ban, actively enforcing? Because I'll say in Toronto, I have had no issue accessing poppers in various spaces and among various gay men.
Yeah, no, I miss that about Toronto. But when my partner and I moved here, he was very ambitious about finding out where he could buy poppers, and he tried every single trick to get in on the where to get poppers at what store would sell them, and he would just stand outside and hang out with the people who worked there and ask again and ask in different ways, and across the board he was just there was zero inroads. Like he just could not find a store that would sell them. Yeah, people sell them, is from what I have heard. But if anyone else knows any different, I'm really curious to understand more about Vancouver poppers distribution. Academically, of course.
I'm just, I'm curious too, because I know the Australian government is currently has a sort of plan in the works to ban poppers, similar to here. And so there's a group of physicians there who are advocating for the opposite and sort of looking to make the argument that banning poppers would lead to gay men using other sexually enhancing drugs, like crystal meth, for example. And so I wonder, like, I think it's just like an interesting research question, like the impact that the ban has had on gay men and their substance use and sexual satisfaction. I mean, any number of things.
Just one more thing quickly to speak to Rob's point earlier. Like when I used to do, would do HIV testing, and back in the earlier days when it was like condoms were like pretty much the option for like most forms of prevention. Like that was one thing that I, as a queer person in the bathhouse, would recommend to guys who are struggling with their condom use. Would be like, well, like one thing that you could try is like some poppers, because it makes it a little bit easier to get fucked. So I think that resonates with like what I have seen to be the case in terms of poppers use. So that, like, you know, banning them may have like more of a harmful impact than is first like immediately obvious. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for those responses. I think we've got 2 questions from the audience. So why don't can I ask you to go first?
Thank you. Thank you for speaking. I really appreciated hearing your comments. Thank you, Dane, for just saying what you just said, because that's where I'm going to go. Mark Randall, HIV Community Link Calgary, for the recorders in the back. In my community, since the ban of poppers, I have watched men in my community gravitate to more chemsex activity as a result of the lack of access to poppers. And I would really be curious to see some research around the impacts of the popper ban and the move of gay men to stronger or different forms of substance use as a way of compensating for that lack of poppers. My introduction to poppers, 1975 on the dance floor doing disco. That's how fucking old I am. So it was never about sex, it was about getting high and dancing.
Still is, it still is.
It still is about getting high and dancing. But I would really be interested to know and see some research, and I'm hoping that Cameron, that maybe that's the lens you may take going forward in your research, is taking a look at the broader impacts of maybe substance change as a result of the popper ban. And poppers are available in Calgary as well. If anybody needs to know how or where, just come see me and I'll explain it to you, because I'm not so sure it's legal either. Yeah, that's my question and my observation.
Okay, thank you.
Marc-André from Gatineau. As you're pondering what your asks might be of Health Canada, I just want to offer this experience. Probably about 15 years ago, I was coordinating efforts to get Naloxone 9 banned from condoms, to force manufacturers to stop putting Naloxone 9 on condoms. I won't get into why. There's good reasons for that. But my point is that I had to knock on about 700 different doors to find out who at Health Canada was responsible for regulation around that, because it fell in the cracks between medical devices and substances and so on and so forth. But when you do find whoever is responsible for it, and you think that they might be amenable to this and be more or less on side with the kind of messaging you want, one of the great benefits, Health Canada did not agree to ban it. However, they agreed to put out, I can't remember what it was called. It was in the same format as the EPI updates that PHAC produces. So it was just a 2-pager on Naloxone 9 explaining what it is and what some of the concerns are with some of the ways that it might be used. And we actually proposed language, and they took up 90% of it, almost word for word. It was Health Canada-fied in a lot of ways, but that might be something to consider if you think that they would be amenable to it and it's not going to become some horrible document that's then going to be out there from Health Canada. That might be one avenue to pursue.
Cool. Good work, too. Thank you.
Yeah, so Dane, at the end of your presentation, you mentioned something about that you would have some data or some outcomes to report kind of a year from now. So I interpret that to mean that you're doing some kind of evaluation of your your sort of chemsex program or your harm reduction program. Can you maybe describe a little bit about what that's about?
Yes, so right now we're working with an evaluation consultant on some sort of like primitive evaluation work. So before this thing goes live, before it's out in the world, we want to know, does it resonate with our target audience? We'll do some pre and post questions around increases in knowledge around some key aspects of the campaign. We're doing a number of focus group consultations before it launches, engaging guys who P&P from across the province, guys specifically who use crystal meth as well, guys from other diverse communities of gay men. And also we're looking at doing some work with family and friends of guys who P&P as well. So that's just to say that there will be some pre-launch evaluation work, and then similarly to the Sex You Want, we would certainly hope to work with our research partners in the province to do more robust sort of post-launch evaluation work. So I don't have a lot of details. I would say it's very much in its early stages, but like I would say with all of our campaigns, we're really looking to understand our reach, understand how our campaigns resonate with gay men in the province, and lessons learned that can support folks who are doing health promotion work in our community.
Okay, that's great. I mean, it sounds like there's lots of opportunity then for
yeah, no, there really is. And just like I kind of have a question for the audience. So we're really intentional around using the term party and play. Because we believe that that's the language that the community is using. But I'm increasingly hearing chemsex, but it's only really in circles of academics, in places like settings like these, at conferences. And so I'm just curious if anyone would like to share, is chemsex, is that language is there like uptake around that with gay men in our communities? It's just a question I want to pose to folks. Take a poll. Take a poll. What you heard. So, like, show of hands, like, just P&P. So we'll do P&P first. Raise your hand if what you see in your work and in your personal life is guys referring to party and play. Okay, and on things like Grindr and social sexual apps, what about chemsex? Interesting, okay. Thanks, that's reassuring.
And sorry, just one other follow-up comment. So I wanted to really thank the previous speaker for giving us a clear hypothesis that we can test actually within the Momentum study in Vancouver, because the first phase of Momentum actually spanned the pre and the post-ban period, and we can totally look at whether that actually had an impact on high-risk sex or use of other drugs after the ban. So thanks, this is great. Bye.
Just a comment. I think that chemsex is like more popular in Europe, though. It is like really much more commonly used term there, which makes sense. Like if it came through emails. I also noticed like mephedrone on your slides, which just like doesn't like I don't think that it's really hit the market in North America yet. So yeah, that was interesting too.
Yeah, I think there were a few questions in that questionnaire that were, because they were largely for an EU audience, that were a little awkward for Canadians, but yes.
Yeah, thank you.
I think I saw a hand in the audience there earlier, but they might have been stretching. Is that you? Yes?
Yeah, during council, to answer your question, I rarely hear people talking about chemsex or P&P during my counseling sessions. They're talking more about partying, and with the capital T.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they're rarely saying, I did P&P this weekend. No, I partied this weekend. Mm-hmm. And then we can talk about the matter.
Thanks. Okay, we have under 10 minutes left. So are there any final questions or comments people would like to share? Looks like people are trying to get in, so I guess we'll wrap it up. I wanted to thank all of our panelists for their incredibly comprehensive and engaging presentations. So, you're free.